So I planned to revisit the hierarchy to try and convince you that the results make that effort worthwhile, and more ambitiously to show that we can have a bright future for typology. Here's the plan, a quick word on what the hierarchy does, then justify why going back to it. Most of the talk will be on the typology of controllers. There'll be time at the end for a little on interactions and then conclusions. So the hierarchy is part of the typology of agreement systems. It's concerned with the situation where we have agreement alternatives, and these can be induced by lexical hybrids and by construction mismatches. So, familiar example, it's possible to say committee has decided or have decided. So we have an alternative there, but it's not a free-for-all in that in attributive position, only the singular, this committee, is acceptable. And in order to generalize over problems like this, we typically simply call this type of agreement, Mary has decided, that's just agreement. When there is an alternative, the form that would be induced by the regular, straightforward, simple rules of syntax we call syntactic agreement. When there's something else required, in this case, the influence of semantics, then we call that semantic agreement, and I'll use this color coding throughout. So the hierarchy has these positions, and the constraint is this. I'll read it out so that you can see where my vowels are. For any controller that permits alternative agreements, as we move rightwards along the agreement hierarchy, the likelihood of agreement with greater semantic justification will increase monotonically. So already we've moved away from syntactic semantic to greater semantic justification, implying a scale. And we need to do that for one reason, because there are controllers which have more than two possible agreement possibilities. And notice the claim that it increases monotonically. That is quite a strong constraint. It means that if we have choices at two positions, then the form with greater semantic justification, that possibility must increase monotonically. Now, you know how hierarchies work. If we just have the binary choice, semantic or syntactic agreement, the constraint already rules out most of the possibilities there. And if we add in the requirement that the increase must be monotonic, then you can see that there are a huge number of theoretically possible systems that are excluded by the constraint. So, real examples then for committee nouns. I haven't given you attributive position because we get only singulars here, but I've given data on spoken US English and spoken British English, and you can see that in both cases we get a wonderful set of figures here, from rather low semantic agreement in the verbal predicate up to high semantic agreement in the pronoun. And for a less familiar example, this is from Middle Welsh, 12th up to about the end of the 15th century. Nouns, these are like committee nouns, but they're rather more bellicose with army and throng and so on. You can see we have just slivers of information really, but each individual controller here, each individual noun has agreements in the corpus that are in accord with the hierarchy. We do see a monotonic increase as we move rightwards, and notice that we get only plural agreement for the personal pronoun, but that we also get plural agreement penetrating the attributive position on the hierarchy. Those are familiar, singular, plural. Here's one that's probably a bit less familiar. We have a remnant form that I've called it in Sevocrat that you find with the numerals 2, 3, and 4 and the masculine noun. Goes back to the dual and is now syncretic with the neuter plural. For our purposes, the important thing is that in an attributive position, we get only this remnant form. It has to be ona dva brata or dva dobra brata. In predicate position, we can have this form or the semantically expected masculine plural, as we see here. The relative pronoun can be remnant or masculine plural. The pronoun can only be masculine plural. And here are two corpus studies from the East and from further West. And you can see again, we get the sort of statistics that a psychologist would kill for. A clear monotonic increase as we move up the hierarchy. Those were all number, just very briefly some gender evidence, including famous Russian examples with vrach, where again, we get a semantically justified agreement even in attributive position. So just to show you that graphically, you can see we do get a nice monotonic increase. Well, certainly the hierarchy covers a range of data. Since it was proposed, some people have done very careful, detailed corpus work. So Levine on English, Jörg Fleischer and his colleagues in Marburg on various Germanic languages, the development of, and development of Greek. So we've had that nice progression from being proposed to being measured and justified. You might say, well, that's fine. Why go back to it? Indeed, it is being well cited. Here's one you wouldn't expect, the Journal of Animal and Poultry Production. And yes, I think that journal needed more careful editing, but it was nice to see. But more seriously, there is new work in syntax by these people and others. And we've got the situation where they are doing theoretical syntax, trying to explain parts of the data of the hierarchy. And we have a mismatch between a typology which is rather dated and very recent, up-to-date theoretical syntax. Moreover, typology has moved on in the meantime. Some of us, Eric Round and myself in particular, have been arguing that we should be looking at the successes of other typological disciplines like sociology and psychology and seeing how they've tackled the problems that we as typologists face and learning from them. So in a paper of some while ago, Lazarsfeld talks about substruction, by which he means you take a typology, you ask which dimensions it uses. Are those the right ones? Are there others we could have employed? Would the results be similar? And equally, how do we pin that down to the real data that we're trying to understand and explain? In other words, this is upping the game for typologists. And since Eric and I have recommended it, I thought I should actually do it. So a typology then of controllers. This is the area where most progress has been made. And so this seems to be the area where the typology is in most need of renewing. Now I'm going to take a canonical approach, and just to be quite sure, canonical really isn't the same as what's normal or frequent or what's unmarked or prototypical. No, it's much simpler than that. It's the place that it's easy to measure from. So if we're measuring length, we don't start at 27 or 43.5, we start at 0. But nobody pretends that 0 is the normal length of objects, or indeed that it's a good length of objects. It's not much use for most objects at all. Similarly, 0 Kelvin is the temperature from which we measure, but that's not to say that it's a nice temperature. I think it's really quite unpleasant being at 0 Kelvin, whether you're trying to do theoretical physics or typology. So the canon is the place we can most conveniently agree on and measure from. And for agreement, the place I would want to measure from is the claim that agreement is redundant in the canonical situation. That's to say, if we have very simple rules of syntax that require identity in feature values between controller and target, we could agree if we see that system and we can measure the divergences from it. Now, in this case, I would say a good proportion of Russian does in fact run that way, but it's the divergences from that which we find interesting as typologists. So once again, not saying that that's normal or functional or anything like that, just a very good place to measure from. And so here is the suggestion of how we can measure, calibrate the possible controllers of agreement, particularly with regard to the agreement hierarchy. So we have two dimensions here running, these two dimensions, of course. The cells, please think of them as sort of landmarks on the way, but these are scales running in the two dimensions. If we start here with the noun cup, it looks like a singular. It denotes a singular entity. It takes singular agreement. Everything lines up in just the way that it should in the canonical world. And so it's a very good measuring point and it's extremely boring. And the associated phrase, the cup, well, the same holds true. Let's move on. Here we come to what I've called OR. This is the logical OR. We select one value. So Russian jiajia has a good reason to be feminine, the way it inflects. It has a good reason to be masculine, its meaning. It's simply masculine. One value is selected. And so it's less canonical than cup, but in terms of agreement, it's still canonical. It simply takes masculine agreements. And the winner of the prizes similarly denotes a singular entity, takes singular agreement, and so on. That's canonical, and for today, boring. This is where the entertainment starts. So for Middle Welsh, as we saw, there are good reasons why these collectives might be singular or plural, and indeed, both of them do figure in agreement and are subject to the hierarchy. At the constructional end, we have this girl and boy are playing happily together, singular and plural, good reasons for both. We find both according to the agreement hierarchy. Then we move on to what I've called extraneous. So all the instances here are local in the sense that the information needed by the rules of agreement can be found locally on the lexical entry or within the controller construction, controller phrase, better phrase. These are instances where that's not true. And I'll illustrate those first. And then I want to say that this is actually a cline. It's a more or less matter, not so cut and dried as a diagram suggests. So instances of extraneous agreement. First, those of you who were here at the beginning would have heard that really interesting talk by Evgenia Renkovskaya. So some of these examples will be familiar. This one is from Nakanunya, the familiar situation where Yelena has got the crazy idea that she should choose who she marries, and this is causing her parents some distress. So the maid says to her, Maminka plachut, your mother are crying. And my point is that no amount of staring at the lexical entry of Maminka will give you a feature value that would imply plural agreement. In some sense, there is something extraneous that has to be imposed on this controller in order to get you plural agreement. Note that it's the opposite of what we're used to. We're used to things like voi, addressed to a single individual to get a politeness effect, and then we worry about the agreements. Here, there's nothing in the controller to get it. It's purely the agreement that produces the politeness effect. Another sort of extraneous agreement is the pancake sentences, which take their name from example 8, panikakarekot, pancakes is good, which means, you know, the business of cooking them up together in the kitchen and eating them together in the fridge, you know, all that sort of stuff is good. You get this in, I think, all of the languages of Scandinavia, to a lesser extent in English, to a limited extent in Russian. But the point is, again, no amount of looking at panikaka will predict singular agreement. There's something else going on there. Nevertheless, I'm glad to say there's an agreement hierarchy effect. The attributive modifier is agreeing syntactically with its head, whereas all the other agreement hierarchy positions can take neuter singular agreement, which defines the construction. So these are the parts that we want to look at, 2 dimensions from local to extraneous, and from individual lexeme through to free construction. We'll look at those dimensions in turn, first that one, then hoping to convince you of the point of extraneous agreement, and then coming again down this dimension. The first is by far the best attested, so that'll take us a little longer, but I won't dwell on every example. So this is moving then from unique or virtually unique hybrids, where it's very clear where we can, as it were, fix the source of the agreement alternatives, through to fairly free constructions, where it's a matter of the constructions, but not of any particular lexeme. So you see that Russian has been enormously fruitful for this research. Here's the Russian noun para, a wonderful example from Bunyan, para. So we get singular attributive modifiers, a singular verb, then carrying on, zakatori and so forth, a singular relative pronoun. So all of those are singular, and then we get a plural pronoun as in example 12. That's true of every example I found, but here, this nice paper, there's an example of a plural, a pronoun, but that's fine. That would still be within the constraint of the hierarchy. So my point is, when you look at these agreements, the place where the issue is to be located is clearly the lexical entry of the Russian noun para. On then, you might expect this to be, well, there's a set of similar nouns which can be lumped together, and back to the famous committee nouns. Here I've compiled data from various sources, mainly written, but this one is spoken and this one too. For 4 committee nouns, for which, as you can see, we have a lot of data. These figures look strange. The person there counted until she had 100 examples. Let's look at the British English example data here. You can see that there is quite a substantial difference between the agreements we find with a noun like with the noun government and the noun family. Quite substantial. And although the numbers are different across the different varieties, by and large, we find the same progression. In other words, more semantically justified agreement with family than with government. Now, if you're a syntactician, this might really worry you. Is it the case that we're going to have to say that the lexical entry of particular nouns has a percentage figure on them, and that this is sort of weighted according to the variety you speak? It really does look like a nightmare. Fortunately, there's a neat paper by Joosten and others that I've mentioned at the bottom on the similar problem in Dutch. And they look at the semantics of these items. They talk about the profile of them in terms of how readily we can access the members of the group. So if you contrast, let's say, an old club and an old audience, an old club could have been going for 100 years and be open to 10-year-olds and under, whereas an old audience must mean that the individuals comprising it are elderly. Now, I won't go right through it. They have various tests, but the point is that the more readily you can access the members of the group, the more likely you are to find plural agreement. It doesn't work perfectly, but it works pretty well. And the moral for today is that in these instances, we can locate the agreement choices within the lexical entries, given that we have access to the semantics. In other words, family and government are rather different, and typologically, they're more like para than you might expect, because we have to treat them individually. The similar story for Russian hybrids. You remember the Panov survey with around 4,000 respondents, where they asked about nouns like vrach when denoting a female, what happens with predicate and attributive agreement. We get masculine and feminine in both. And the basic picture, this is arranging people by age group, is that we get a very nice agreement hierarchy effect with more feminines in predicate agreement than in attributive position. But within those two positions, the individual noun also makes a very substantial difference. So it's not that there are vrach nouns, there are indeed, but they vary one from another in the agreements that they take. All right, now we're moving up from individual nouns closer to constructions, and please look at 13 and 14, which are, I think, more interesting than for a long time I realized. So for me, the majority is or are in favor are both 100% fine. So we'd have to say, wouldn't we, that majority is a hybrid noun which allows both singular and plural agreement. On the other hand, if we look at the majority of the voters is or are in favor, again, both fine, but are is now rather more likely than in 13. So this would suggest that what we've got is a headedness mismatch, that it looks as though the head of the phrase is the majority, but the dependent phrase of the voters is having an impact on the agreement in a way that strict headedness wouldn't allow for. Now, I think that both of those things are true, that majority is sort of weakened in that it's becoming like a hybrid, but that also we have a headedness mismatch, and the dependent phrase is, as it were, implied by majority in a way that a dependent isn't implied by nouns like committee or government. So I find these really interesting as being on the boundary, showing that we really have got a scale here from individual hybrids running through to more construction-like problems. And the next one is further down, the rather nice French example, ton phénomène de fille, literally your phenomenon of a daughter, your amazing daughter, where phénomène is masculine, fille is feminine. You have to have ton, or you have to have masculine as attributive, the attributive modifier, but all other agreement targets will be feminine. So here we have a construction with a reduced qualitative noun, phénomène, there is being reduced, and the dependent is taking on the part of the agreement duties. We saw the Sauerkraut phrases where we have a fairly free possibility of the noun there, so long as it's masculine. So we're moving towards constructions. The other two come right up to free constructions, conjoined phrases. Those are a big story, so I'll leave them out today. and just mentioned the interesting comitative phrases of Russian. So although it looks as though we have a clear head-dependent structure, it's nevertheless the case that we can get plural agreement, as it were, including the dependent phrase, and we regularly do get plural there. We can, as you know, get a plural agreement even in attributive position, and we normally do for the remaining position. So we've seen, I hope you agree, a cline from, or dimension running from individual lexical hybrids right the way through to free constructions. And although I haven't given you all the examples there, constrained by the hierarchy. Let me move to the other dimension. So agreement can depend on information which is not available locally. That's to say, not within the standard lexical entry or syntactic phrase. So you saw this with the Turgenev example, maminka plačut, and you get the same effect here with the personal pronoun, ani. If anybody's got one with a relative pronoun, do please send me an email post-haste. So that's honorific agreement, where we say that is extraneous to the controller. And pancake sentences, another example here, because I want to show you that this is very generally available. So even with a very animate apparent controller here, foreign secretary, you can still get this pancake agreement. So the point about this example, when you say not so stupid, it's not such a stupid idea to conceive of having a new foreign secretary. So having said that anything will go there, on the other hand, it is the case that in most instances, we find either a mass noun or a nominalization or infinitive. So yes, it's extraneous, but there are some sorts of controller that more readily go into this construction than others. So having, I hope, convinced you of this second dimension, we'll now go down the examples of extraneous overrides in turn, going from those that more readily override a phrase, an item to a phrase. There are only 4 that I've identified, and thank you, Russian. 2 of them come from Russian. This example we saw in the very nice first talk. So this is from Talitsk, out near Perm, where we can say Gosha priехали. This means Gosha and family, people that you associate with him, have arrived. Bogdanov makes clear this absolutely isn't respect. This is simply saying who's associated and comes. And notice that when we talk about associatives, we usually mean a marker on the noun itself or within the noun phrase. This type is really quite unusual cross-linguistically. It's all being done by the agreement. Notice in 20 that we get attributive agreement being singular. Agreement here is singular. It's the other targets that are plural. So again, we get an agreement hierarchy effect. And here a personal pronoun, it's about Kuzma, but why they, that's to say Kuzma and family, don't write to you. So an agreement hierarchy effect for this associative agreement. Also in this paper by Skitova, similar data, though she seems not to have been aware of Bogdanov. So that's associative agreement, and like the honorific agreement, we typically need a noun denoting a person or a pronoun as the controller. So it's limited in that respect. The other 2 possibilities are even less restricted. The first, honorific agreement, yes, as earlier, Those two then require a noun denoting a human. Less restricted would be back agreement in Latin. So these are fairly textbook type examples to make the point. In Latin, you find examples like 25, amantium irae, of lovers the quarrels, plural, amoris integra, of love the renewal, but is. So the verbal predicate here is agreeing with the nominal part of the predicate and not with its subject. And in predicate position, that's possible. When we go to the relative pronoun, te, bi, quod, etc., so the antecedent is te, bi. The relative pronoun quod, though, agrees not with that, but with its own nominal predicate caput, which of boiotia, the capital is. So quod is agreeing with caput, and that is very usual and normal. And then finally, 27, that true piety is where the that ea can't be id, according to the source. It must be agree with its nominal predicate. That's not possible in attributive positions, so we get a nice agreement hierarchy effect. And as you see, increasing likelihood as we go through the hierarchy positions. For real example, Pinkster's wonderful grammar is out, and there are real examples there. And then back to Pancake sentences, they really are very interesting. One point is to say that since you can have neuter singular nouns, then there are instances which are ambiguous, covert. So 28, I claim, is ambiguous, and you see the way it's ambiguous if we make it plural. So in 29, we've got these pictures. These pictures would have been fine, the plural agreement. That's to say, well, you know, if someone had tried a bit harder on the faces, let's say. Whereas 30 is a Pancake sentence. These pictures would have been fine, neuter singular. Imagine two curators talking about an exhibition. Those would have been fine on the entry wall, but the ones we've got are even better. It would have been fine to have them on this wall, is the notion there. So my point for the last two is that they can override whole phrases, phrase-like constructions. So then, that's the picture we've seen. This dimension illustrated in some detail, the distinction between local and extraneous, and then a look at the examples here, of which there are so far exactly 4. It would be nice to investigate these further, and one way to do that is to look at the interactions, what happens when we interact them with other possibilities. So that's the plan for the remaining part. We'll look at what happens when you have combinations of these possibilities and what, in a sense, dominates the other. So first then, what happens if we have lexical hybrids and a constructional mismatch, let's say conjoined noun phrases. This one is from Russian. La sentinelle typically denotes a male and has feminine agreements apart from pronoun when on its own. What happens when you conjoin it? Well, you get a really interesting effect, first pointed out for something similar by John Maygaard, Norwegian master's thesis. So you might expect, given what we thought about French resolution, that basically all feminine, you get feminine and otherwise masculine. Not here. For some speakers, at least, it's absolutely impossible to get feminine agreement in example 31. So you can see that the conjoining is overriding the individual hybrid in 2 ways. Obviously, you get resolution, and so we get a plural, but also the fact that when sentinelle is in an ordinary type sentence, you can ignore the semantics of it and get feminine agreements. But once you conjoin it, that the semantics have to be taken into account. And so we've got masculine plus feminine and masculine agreement. So that was this sort of interaction, and the conjoining, in a sense, overrides. Then, Russian titles. First off, remember Peter the Great in 1722 organized the table of ranks so that if you were addressing somebody important or talking about them, you knew the appropriate title to use. And most of these titles were neuter, like prevasadichilstva. And indeed, we can have neuter agreements, as in 32 from Kapitanskaya Dochka, straightforward neuter agreements. But we also get masculine or feminine verbal predicates, depending on who is meant, and masculine or feminine pronouns, 34, and you have a relative pronoun. So these are hybrids. Fine, we've seen other hybrids. But interestingly, we can now get that interacting with honorific agreement, as in this. Please do enjoy 35. I think it's just wonderful. So, so His Excellency deign, which is already polite, deign plural to wait for you. So here we have honorific agreement, plural, overriding the fact that prevasadichilstva is already a hybrid which could take neuter, masculine or feminine agreements. And the same holds for other L positions. So in 36, I've got one there with a plural pronoun. Again, if anyone's got a plural relative pronoun there, I would be thrilled. Now, you might say, wait a minute, prevasadichilstva is a sign of politeness, so, inverted commas, of course you get plural agreement with it. But no, it's more interesting than that for two reasons. First, on the previous slide, you saw prevasadichilstva with singular agreement. It doesn't have to take honorific agreement. And similarly, we saw maminka with this type of honorific agreement. The two really are dissociated. And as Houtsakas nicely points out, there's a very strange and interesting restriction on this honorific agreement. You use it for people who are not too distant horizontally. So you use it upwards to show respect, but the person you're respecting mustn't be too far from you. And this certainly fits these examples. So this is the Batman talking about the man who is in charge of the military school. So it's someone he has very regular dealings with horizontally, but has to respect vertically. Oh, thank you. And similarly, the maminka example, it was the maid saying it. She's in the household. She sees this lady all the time, never so horizontally close, but vertically distant. So my point is then, you can't look at prevasadichilstva and say, this must take plural agreement. No, you need to know the situation, and the plural is, as it were, imposed from outside. Right, now we have a hybrid overwritten by a Pancake sentence. So here, the government is a hybrid in Norwegian. A bit like in English, it can take singular or plural agreement. And saying this is rude, it's saying that the government are stupid. However, you can then have a Pancake effect with the neuter singular, and that gives you the reading, having a new government wouldn't be such a bad idea. But now it's the neuter, as it were, that is overriding, if you like, the hybrid agreement. I'd love to show you this possibility, but I can't. And I think the reason is that given that the examples are individually rare, we need a language that actually has both types in order to have any chance at all. And I haven't found such a language yet. So I think this is a not very significant gap. And finally, conjoining overridden by a pancake sentence. Now, this one was chosen for Norwegian 39. I'm rather proud because I said it ought to work and it did. So Magnus Carlsen and Bobby Fischer would have been wonderful, new to singular, meaning, wouldn't it have been great, you know, if they'd been together and had a match? I suppose for this audience, I should have said Magnus Carlsen and Michael Tal, and then you'd have got it instantly. The point is having them together and playing is what would have been wonderful. I cooked up 30. Messi, Neymar, and Mbappe is daunting for any defense. That I think is 100% fine. And then I found this one on the web. I wouldn't like you to think I'd read the Telegraph to get it. I got it on the web, but here we have a nominal predicate, and so it's not so convincing as this one. The point being simply then, conjoining is overridden by the pancake effect. This one similarly, this is a stage on where we've conjoined hybrids. This is me trying to write chicklet. After consulting her diary for next Monday, Rachel decides that a reading group, who enjoy long discussions, her family, who are very demanding, is simply too much for one afternoon. So she postpones the family's visit. Okay, so it's the reading group and the family is too much. Right, please enjoy Czech. I look at these examples every now and then and think, really? And then I bump into a Czech speaker and test them again, and they just say, oh, yes, yes. So honestly, these do seem to be right. The rule is this. You have conjoined phrases, I'm sorry. You have conjoined phrases in subject position and a numeral in predicate position, and the verb agreement is controlled by the numeral in the predicate. If it's 2, 3, or 4, you get plural agreement, and if it's 5 or above, you get singular agreement. Wow. Now, you might think, well, have we really got subject and predicate right? And there are two tests I tried. One is you can change this for a semi-copular, become, in the new mathematics, one time something becomes that. And then indeed this goes into the instrumental, suggesting that it is not the subject. And the other is what we used to call subject to object raising. In the new mathematics, they consider 1 and 2 to be something else. And that again gets you subject predicate. So we have a back agreement, which is overriding conjoining. So I think it's easiest to see what's gone on graphically. Basically, the overriding one is always the one, as it were, down or across. Putting it nicely, we get overrides along either dimension, lexeme-to-phrase or local to extraneous. The one further from the straightforward hybrid dominates. And we get agreement, which has got a greater degree of semantic justification, but that's another story. So to sum up, we've looked at the hierarchy, just tackled the most urgent problem, the controllers, and sketched out a typology of these controllers. And this is part of a cycle from proposing the hierarchy to people then doing very careful and detailed measurement, to understanding it better, to people in theoretical syntax tackling part of the issue, and hoping that the cycle now will go round again with a better typology and better measurement and so on. and hoping that this will induce people doing the theoretical syntax to look at more of the range of the data. And I hope on the positive front too, to say that this shows we can do linguistics as normal social science, which is what some of us are arguing for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Corbett. And now let's get to the questions. There was one question from Ruprecht van Wanderwelts. You can see it in the chat, but probably you could repeat that. You could read it.
It's really just a side remark. It's when you said that with the sentinel question. Yeah. Obviously, the hearer supposes that the sentinel that is traveling with his or her wife is a he, which of course, given equal marriage, is not a given anymore. It's clear. I mean, it's clear. It's clear that this is the supposition that the hearer makes, and that leads to this resolving. But it actually,
yes, if it's two women, I'll bet you any amount of money that the feminine is what you'll find. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. Very nice.
It was set up in the old days when one assumed, I think, and this was meant to imply that it was his.
Yes, yes, it's just struck me, but it's quite, it's I don't want to say trivial, but it's well, it's very nice that we see how semantics gets profiled by the contrast.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Maxim, your comment.
Yes, thank you so much. I had a small parallel that I'm now very much unsure of, but in Russian we have these phrases like I know again новая информационная стратегия, это было бы хорошо. Which are also neuter, and but probably in this case this has something to do with eta, so I'm not sure if it is a direct parallel to these pancake examples, but probably at least to some extent.
Oh, thanks so much. Yes, I did write about those ages ago, and I think they are the beginning of pancake sentences. The fact that you get eta and not on and that or whatever is already a sort of distancing, if you like. And you also get the start of pancake sentences in those examples that were way back in the collection of colloquial texts. You get examples like yes, хорошо. Now, typically you need the intonation to do it, as it were, whereas in a genuine Norwegian pancake sentence, it sounds like a normal subject predicate sentence. So when I said casually, oh, and you get this to a limited extent in Russian, this is what I meant, that I think you have got the start of pancake sentences, but clearly not so far on as Norwegian. You see the same sort of effects when you conjoin infinitive phrases. You know, simple-minded rule says conjoining, you ought to get a plural. But if you think of conjoining, you know, eating a lot and then swimming is bad for you. That's the sort of example I've got in mind when you try that in Russian.
Like пить, курить плохо, like пить и курить плохо.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds good, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And the point is, just as with Norwegian, it's precisely in that environment where it's easiest to get them. Yeah. I would bet that you could do it with nominalizations relatively easily, but clearly much less easily with ordinary regular noun phrases. So yes, they're on the way in. Come back in 30 years and you'll be almost as good as the Norwegians at it.
We're still baking our pancakes.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you. Masha, your question.
Thank you. I'm terribly sorry if I missed it. I've been wondering whether another case for extraneous agreement would be something like common gender nouns in Russian. I suppose you do not include nouns like sudya because they're morphologically feminine, but I've been wondering, for instance, about zero declension nouns like protégé, which can be either feminine or masculine, and nothing in the noun itself says whether it would be masculine or feminine.
Ah, nice one. Thank you very, very much. Yes. I think that's really helpful in terms of saying that this is a scale. So you're right in that morphologically, absolutely, there's nothing to say this should be masculine or feminine. On the other hand, in the context, it's clearly a matter of the referent of that noun that is established as being masculine or feminine. And so it's, I haven't put that very well, but I'm trying to say that that's not quite so clear cut, which is exactly what we expect if this is indeed a scale and not a matter of yes or no. So thank you. I think that's a really nice one.
Thank you. There was another comment from Ruprecht von Waardeveld. We can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay, we just discussed it in colloquial German. We can do pancakes too. I mean, but you probably know this. Yes, schön, neue Fenster wäre schön, and that's. But you couldn't write it. You couldn't write it. It would you know reget uche. It would kind of not be okay.
Yeah.
It was, yes. And then the question was also, do you want to ask, or I mean,
yeah, we were wondering about the sentence like with the pancakes, like frische Pfannkuchen wäre eine gute Idee. So fresh pancakes in the plural, but then would be a good idea with the verb in the singular. And we were wondering, is that a pancake sentence or is that back agreement? Because
right.
A good idea.
A part of the point of the analysis is that these things do run into each other.
Yes.
Mentioned earlier. Certainly, it's much easier to get those sorts of effects with a singular nominal predicate. Just as, yeah, for me in English, £200 is too much, is unproblematic, whereas for anybody for whom it is problematic, £500 is a large sum, will be easier. So having a nominal predicate certainly helps things along, as in some of the previous examples. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was another comment from Peter. Peter, do you want to read it out or?
Oh yeah, pancakes in Lithuanian. Great. Yes. Well, that's where they should be appearing, isn't it? If this is partly aerial, they're in the right place. It'd be interesting to know whether there's evidence for them appearing as it were spontaneously, or if there's any evidence that they are due to contact there. It seems, however, that as soon as you present data, people start saying, oh yes, they're in my language and they're in my language too. So I suspect that these are very much more widespread than we've been led to believe. There's a nice book on gender in Romance languages by Michele Lopocaro, and he's got several examples from Romance, which is not where they're typically talked about. So yeah, they're much more widespread than is generally thought. but thanks for the Lithuanian. And if you have a great reference to send me, Peter, I'd be delighted.
Thank you very much. And now we have 2 minutes for the last question. Masha.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that sometimes it's claimed that Russian does have agreement with the predicate, which seems to be the case you demonstrate, Valerin. It is not that clear, but at least as far as I remember, Nichols does claim it for examples like это была Ula. And if you do assume that it is predicate agreement, then Russian would have both types. You wanted to compare in one example, if we put something like Maminka in the predicate, like это были Maminka, это была Maminka, and so on. I'm not sure if it's which is subject and which is predicate, but at least it has been claimed as far as I remember.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's a paper from the 90s by Yelena Parducheva, and I forget her co-author, about back agreement in Russian. And I spent a long time worrying about it, and it's very tricky. The sort of examples you get in the 19th century with 2 nominals of different gender become less and less possible in the 20th century because of this wretched rule of predicates going into the instrumental. So just when you're almost there, one of them's in the instrumental, so you can't tell. But you're right, I should look again at that and see if there's a way of constructing a plausible interaction with Russian. And then my typology paper would become almost entirely about Russian instead of largely about Russian. Thank you very much for that comment. That's great.